I woke that morning knowing I had lived before. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything I touched, everything I saw, until I could no longer tell which memories were real and which were ghosts of a life I should not remember. The bedroom was unfamiliar in its familiarity. I knew the weight of the velvet curtains, the pattern of morning light across the Persian rug, the faint smell of beeswax and lavender that clung to the carved mahogany furniture. But I also knew something else. I knew this room from a different angle. From the doorway, not the bed. From the position of someone who entered with fresh linens and left before being noticed. A governess, a servant, someone invisible. I sat up slowly, my hands moving to my throat where I expected to find the simple collar of a day dress, but found instead the soft silk of an expensive nightgown. My fingers trembled as they traced the delicate lace at the neckline. This was wrong. This was not mine. But the ring on my left hand caught the morning light, and I stared at it with a mixture of recognition and horror. Gold with a small sapphire. The Ashford family ring. I was wearing the Ashford family ring. Lady Eleanor Ashford. That was what the maid had called me last night when she helped me undress. Her voice respectful, her eyes lowered. Lady Ashford. The words had felt like glass in my mouth when I tried to repeat them, sharp and foreign and utterly impossible, because I was Eleanor Gray. I had always been Eleanor Gray. Governesses did not become ladies. They did not marry into old families. They did not sleep in rooms like this, on sheets like these, with rings like this weighing down their fingers. But I had other memories too. Memories of a wedding 6 months ago, of standing in the chapel at Ashford Manor with my hand in Julian's, of speaking vows I could hear myself saying but could not remember meaning. I remembered a wedding breakfast, the weight of the ivory dress, the cold politeness in Julian's eyes as he kissed my cheek for the gathered guests. I remembered moving into this room, this bed, this life. But those memories felt thin, like illustrations in a book I had read but not lived. They did not have the texture of truth. The truth was something else. The truth was a narrow room in the East Wing where I had slept for 3 years. The truth was teaching Latin to a boy who laughed too loudly and cried too easily, a boy with his brother's dark eyes and his mother's gentle mouth. The truth was Julian Ashford passing me in hallways without seeing me, his mind always elsewhere, always on his work, on his machines, on the experiments that kept him locked in his laboratory until dawn. The truth was loving him in the way servants learn to love their employers, silently and without hope, a love that asks for nothing because it knows it will receive nothing. And the truth was Thomas. Thomas Ashford, the younger brother, 22 years old, full of life and laughter and careless brilliance. Thomas, who had died. I pressed my hands to my face and felt the wetness on my cheeks before I realized I was crying. Thomas had died. I remembered it with a clarity that made my chest ache. A riding accident on a November morning, the horse spooked by something in the woods, Thomas thrown against the stone wall that bordered the eastern pasture. I remembered Julian's face when they brought the body back to the house. I remembered the funeral, the rain, the way Julian had stood at the graveside without weeping, his jaw set, his hands clenched, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. I remembered the months after, the way grief had turned him into something cold and mechanical, the way he had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped being anything but a mind bent on a single impossible purpose. He had wanted to bring Thomas back. He had said it once, late at night, when I had brought him tea in the laboratory and found him surrounded by blueprints and equations, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He had looked at me as if I were not there and said, "I will bring him back. I will undo it. I will make it so it never happened." And I, foolish and heartbroken and desperate to ease his pain, had said nothing, had set down the tea and left him to his grief and his impossible dreams. But Thomas was not dead. That was the other truth, the one that made no sense, the one that shattered everything I thought I knew. Thomas was alive. I had seen him last night at dinner, laughing at something his mother said, reaching across the table to steal an olive from Julian's plate. Thomas, solid and real and utterly, impossibly alive. I rose from the bed, my legs unsteady, and walked to the window. The grounds of Ashford Manor spread out before me, green and manicured and peaceful in the spring morning. The gardens, the hedge maze, the distant line of woods where Thomas had died, where Thomas should have died. But when I closed my eyes, I could see it differently. I could see another version of that morning, a version where the wall had been repaired the week before, where the stones were firm and the horse did not rear, where Thomas rode home safely and complained about the cold and lived. Julian had done it. Somehow, impossibly, Julian had done what he said he would do. He had changed the past. He had saved his brother, and in doing so, he had changed everything else. A knock at the door startled me back to the present. The maid entered without waiting for an answer, her arms full of fresh towels, her face carefully neutral. She bobbed a small curtsy and said, "Good morning, my lady. Shall I prepare your bath?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. She moved efficiently around the room, drawing the curtains fully open, laying out clothes I did not remember choosing. A day dress in pale blue, gloves, a cameo brooch, the uniform of a lady. I watched her work and felt the strangeness of it settle over me like a shroud. In another life, I would have been the one drawing the curtains, laying out the clothes, invisible and efficient and beneath notice. What had Julian done? What had he changed? The maid paused at the wardrobe and turned back to me with a small, hesitant smile. "Will you be joining the family for breakfast, my lady? Or shall I have a tray sent up?" The family. Julian and his mother, the Dowager Lady Ashford, and Thomas. My family now, according to this new reality. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "I will come down." "Very good, my lady." The maid curtsied again and disappeared into the adjoining bathing room. I heard the sound of water running, the soft clink of porcelain, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands gripping the silk coverlet. I needed to see Julian. I needed to look into his eyes and know if he remembered, if he carried the same impossible double memory that I did, the weight of two lives, two timelines, two versions of us. Or if he had succeeded so completely that he had erased himself along with Thomas's death, leaving only this new Julian, this stranger who had married me, not out of love, but out of some alteration in fate I did not yet understand. The bath was warm and scented with rose oil. The maid helped me dress, lacing my corset, fastening the tiny buttons at my wrists, arranging my hair in a style I had only ever seen from a distance. I watched myself in the mirror and saw a stranger. A lady with pale skin and dark hair and eyes that held too many questions. I looked like someone who belonged in this room, in this life, but I felt like a ghost, haunting a body that should not be mine. When I descended the staircase, my hand trailing along the polished banister, I saw Thomas in the entrance hall below. He was laughing at something, his coat slung over one shoulder, his hair disheveled in the way it always was, the way it had been before he died. He looked up as I reached the landing, and his face broke into a wide, easy grin. "Eleanor! There you are. Mother was beginning to think you'd sleep till noon." I stopped, my hand tightening on the banister. He spoke to me with such casual affection, as if we had known each other always, as if I were truly his sister by marriage, and not a governess he had barely noticed. I managed a smile, though it felt brittle on my lips. "I would not miss breakfast, Thomas." He bounded up the stairs to meet me, taking my arm with easy familiarity. Julian's already shut himself in the laboratory, of course. Some crisis with the new device. He's been at it since before dawn. Thomas rolled his eyes with fond exasperation. You'd think saving a man's life once would be enough, but my brother insists on perfecting every detail. Saving a man's life. The words hung in the air between us. I stared at Thomas, at his living, breathing face, and felt the dizziness return. Did he know? Did he remember dying? "Thomas," I said carefully, guiding us down the stairs. "What do you remember about that day? The day Julian saved you?" He glanced at me, surprised. "The accident, you mean?" He shrugged. "Not much, honestly. I remember riding out that morning and then waking up in my bed 3 days later with the worst headache of my life and Julian hovering over me like a madman. He said I'd been thrown from my horse, hit my head on the wall, but then he did something with that machine of his, and when I woke again, it was as if it had never happened. The doctor said it was a miracle. His grin turned rueful. Mother said it was proof that God watches over fools and younger sons. So he remembered the accident, but only vaguely, as something that had almost happened but had been undone. He did not carry the double memory. He did not remember dying. For him, there was only this timeline, this life, this version of events where he had been saved before the worst could occur. We entered the dining room, and the Dowager Lady Ashford looked up from her correspondence with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She was a woman of iron wrapped in velvet, gracious and cold and utterly proper. She had never liked me, I remembered suddenly. Not in the other life, when I was the governess. She had thought me too quiet, too watchful, too clever for my station. And now, in this life, she had other reasons to dislike me. I could see it in the tightness around her mouth, the way her gaze slid over me without quite landing. "Good morning, Eleanor. I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you." I took my seat at the table, my hands folded in my lap, my heart hammering. The room was too warm, too bright, too full of the smell of toast and tea and the wrongness of everything. "Thomas will be attending the Royal Society lecture this afternoon," Lady Ashford continued. Her tone light and pointed. "Perhaps you might accompany him. It would do you good to be seen in society more often. People talk, you know, when a new bride keeps to herself." The words were a gentle rebuke, a reminder that I had not been performing my role adequately. I was Lady Ashford now. I had duties, appearances to maintain. I could not hide in my room, wrestling with memories that should not exist, mourning a life that had been erased. "I would be happy to accompany Thomas," I said quietly. Lady Ashford nodded, satisfied, and returned to her letters. Thomas winked at me across the table, trying to lighten the mood, but I could barely manage a smile in return. All I could think about was Julian, locked in his laboratory, working on the device that had rewritten our lives. After breakfast, I excused myself and made my way through the familiar corridors of Ashford Manor. I knew where the laboratory was. I had brought tea there countless times in the other life, had stood in the doorway watching Julian work, had learned the rhythms of his obsession. But I had never entered. Governesses did not enter laboratories. They did not intrude on the private work of gentlemen. But I was not a governess now. I was his wife. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and locked. I knocked, softly at first, then louder when there was no answer. "Julian, it's Eleanor. I need to speak with you." Silence, then the sound of footsteps, slow and reluctant, and the scrape of the bolt being drawn back. The door opened just enough for me to see his face, and I felt my breath catch. He looked terrible. His dark hair was uncombed, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his jaw rough with stubble. He wore the same shirt he must have worn yesterday, the collar open, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms stained with ink and something darker. Oil, perhaps, or soot. He looked at me with an expression I could not read, something between recognition and wariness, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Eleanor." His voice was hoarse, as if he had not used it in hours. "This is not a good time." I pushed the door open wider, stepping past him into the laboratory before he could stop me. The room was chaos. Workbenches covered with tools and papers, and mechanical parts I could not name. A large device in the center, all brass gears and glass chambers and coiled wires, humming with a low, ominous sound. The air smelled of metal and electricity and something else, something sharp and wrong that made my eyes water. "What is this?" I turned to face him, my voice shaking. "What have you done, Julian?" He closed the door behind me, his movements careful, controlled. "You should not be here, Eleanor. This work is dangerous. I already know it's dangerous. I know what you did." I pressed my hands together to stop them from trembling. "I remember Julian. I remember the other timeline. I remember Thomas dying. I remember being a governess in this house, invisible to everyone, especially you. And I remember waking up yesterday as your wife, with a life I never lived and memories that don't belong to me." His face went very still. The weariness in his eyes sharpened into something else. Fear, perhaps, or hope. He took a step toward me, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "You remember?" "Yes." I met his gaze and felt the weight of it, the intensity that had always frightened and fascinated me in equal measure. "I remember both, the life that was and this one. Do you?" He turned away, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Yes. God help me, yes. I thought I was the only one. I thought the temporal echo would only affect me, the one who operated the machine. But you were there, weren't you? That morning, when I made the final adjustment to the device. You brought me tea. You stood in the doorway and watched me activate it. I nodded slowly, the memory surfacing. I had thought he did not see me. He never saw me. But I had been there at the moment the machine had changed everything, and somehow that had been enough to tie me to both timelines. Julian turned back to me, and I saw the anguish in his face, raw and unguarded. "I saved him, Eleanor. I saved Thomas." But the machine did not just prevent his death. It rewrote causality around the event. Stabilizing the new timeline required compensatory changes. Marriages that should have happened did not. Marriages that should not have happened did. He gestured helplessly at the space between us. "We were not supposed to be married. In the original timeline, I was too consumed by grief to think of anything but my work. My mother arranged matches for me, but I refused them all. And you left the house. You found another position. We never spoke again. Then why?" I stepped closer to him, my heart pounding. "Why are we married in this timeline?" "Because the machine needed to anchor the change," he said, his voice breaking. "It needed something stable, something that would keep Thomas's survival from collapsing back into his death. And somehow it chose this. It chose us. A marriage 6 months ago, arranged by my mother, accepted by me because I was too tired and too indifferent to refuse. A marriage that bound you to this house, to this family, to me." He looked at me with such desperation that I felt something crack open in my chest. "I did not choose this, Eleanor. I did not mean to trap you in a life you never wanted. I only wanted to save my brother." "And you did," I whispered. "Thomas is alive. That's what matters. But at what cost?" Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You were erased, Eleanor. Your life, your choices, your freedom. You were made into something you never chose to be, bound to a man who never even noticed you before, who does not deserve you now." The words hung between us, and I felt tears sting my eyes. But I could not tell him that the life I had lost was not the life I mourned. I mourned the possibility of something else, something that had never existed in either timeline. The possibility of being seen, of being chosen, not by a machine or by fate or by the cold mathematics of temporal causality, but by him freely and fully, and without the shadow of death hanging over us. The device behind us gave a sudden, sharp hum, and Julian's head snapped toward it. His expression shifted from anguish to alarm in an instant. He moved quickly to the workbench, his hands flying over controls I could not understand. "Damn, it's destabilizing." "What does that mean?" It means the timeline is not as stable as I thought. He did not look at me, his attention fixed on the machine. There are echoes, fractures, moments where the two timelines overlap. If it gets worse, if the device fails completely, everything could collapse. We could revert to the original timeline. Thomas could die again. Or we could cease to exist, I said quietly. If the machine created this marriage and the machine fails, what happens to us? Julian's hands stilled on the controls. He looked at me over his shoulder, and I saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke it. I don't know. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the laboratory. Then you have to fix it. You have to stabilize the timeline. I'm trying. His voice was ragged with exhaustion. But every adjustment I make creates new problems. The machine was never meant to sustain changes this large. It was meant for small corrections, minor adjustments. Not this. Not rewriting life and death. Then why did you do it? The question came out sharper than I intended. Why risk everything for this? He turned to face me fully, and for a moment I saw past the exhaustion and the fear to the grief that still lived beneath. Because he was my brother, Eleanor. Because I failed him. Because I was supposed to protect him, and I could not bear the thought of living in a world where he was gone. His honesty stripped away the last of my defenses. I crossed the space between us and took his hand, feeling the roughness of calluses, the faint tremor of exhaustion. I understand, Julian, but you cannot carry this alone. Not anymore. He looked down at our joined hands, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of surprise, of vulnerability, of something deeper I could not yet name. You should hate me, he said softly. I took your life from you. You gave me a different one, I replied. I don't know yet if it's better or worse, but it's mine now, ours. And if the timeline is failing, then we face it together. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Then, slowly, he nodded. Together, he repeated, the words strange and careful in his mouth. The device hummed again, a warning, and Julian released my hand to return to his work. I stayed beside him, watching as he made adjustments, took measurements, muttered calculations under his breath. I did not understand the science, but I understood the stakes. Our existence, our marriage, our fragile new reality, all of it hung on the stability of this machine. And somewhere, beneath the fear and the strangeness and the impossible weight of living two lives at once, I felt something else stirring. A connection to this man I had loved hopelessly in one timeline and married without love in another. A connection forged not by choice, but by necessity, by shared memory and shared danger, by the knowledge that we were the only two people in the world who carried the truth of what had been and what might still be. Whatever came next, whatever the machine did or failed to do, we would face it together. Not as master and governess, not as strangers bound by arrangement, but as two people caught between timelines, trying to save what could be saved and mourning what had already been lost. Julian worked through the morning while I remained at his side, and when the device finally settled into a steady rhythm, he straightened and met my eyes. It will hold, he said, for now. I nodded, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we try again. He glanced toward the door, then back to me. You should go. Thomas will be expecting you for the lecture. Will you come? He hesitated, then shook his head. I need to monitor the device. But Eleanor, he caught my hand before I could turn away. Be careful. The temporal echoes, they can manifest in strange ways. If you see or hear anything unusual, anything that doesn't feel right, come find me immediately. I will, I promised. As I left the laboratory and made my way back through the manor, I felt the double weight of both lives pressing down on me. the governess who loved in silence, and the wife who woke to find herself bound to the man she loved by forces neither of them controlled. Two versions of myself, layered one over the other, and I could not yet tell which was real or if either had ever been. But I knew one thing with certainty. Julian Ashford had changed the past to save his brother, and in doing so, he had rewritten both our fates. Now, we would have to live with the consequences, for better or worse, in a timeline that trembled on the edge of collapse and a marriage that existed only because a machine had decided we belonged together. Whether we could make that marriage into something real, something chosen, something more than an accident of temporal mechanics, remained to be seen. But as I climbed the stairs to change for the afternoon, I felt a flicker of something I had not felt in either lifetime. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but alive. The Royal Society lecture hall was everything I remembered, and nothing I had ever experienced. I had seen it before in the other life, from the upper gallery where servants and women of no consequence were permitted to sit during public demonstrations. I had watched Julian present his theories on electromagnetic resonance from that distant vantage point, close enough to hear his voice, but too far to see the expressions that crossed his face when he spoke of things that mattered to him. Now I sat in the third row, in a seat reserved for the families of members, with Thomas beside me and the weight of my new status pressing down on my shoulders like a velvet cloak. The lecturer was a Dr. Pemberton, an elderly physicist with wild white hair and a tendency to gesture so vigorously that his spectacles slid down his nose. He was speaking about the nature of time, about whether the past could be said to exist in any meaningful sense once it had been lived, or whether it dissolved into nothing more than memory and consequence. The irony was not lost on me. I sat very still, my gloved hands folded in my lap, listening to him discuss the immutability of temporal events while I carried the lived proof that time was far more fragile than anyone in this room understood. Thomas leaned toward me during a pause in the lecture, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Dreadfully dull, isn't it? I don't know why Julian insists these talks are essential. Half of it is pure philosophy, not science at all. I glanced at him, surprised. Julian wanted you to attend? He rolled his eyes with affection. He made me promise, said I needed to understand the theoretical foundations before I could properly appreciate his work, as if I have any intention of spending my life in a laboratory. He grinned. Give me a good horse and an open field over equations any day. The words were light, teasing, but they struck something painful in my chest. In the other timeline, Thomas would never have had the chance to choose horses over equations. He would never have grown old enough to discover what kind of man he might become. Julian had given him that chance, had rewritten reality itself to ensure his brother had a future. And Thomas had no idea what had been sacrificed to secure it. Dr. Pemberton was saying something about causality, about how every event was the inevitable result of the events that preceded it, an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. I felt dizzy listening to him. What happened when that chain was broken? When someone reached back and altered a link, changing not just one event, but everything that flowed from it? Julian had broken the chain, and I was living in the consequences. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the gaslight flickering in a way that made the shadows on the walls move strangely. I blinked, pressing my fingers to my temple, and when I opened my eyes again, everything was normal. But for just a moment, I had seen something else. A version of this room where I sat alone in the upper gallery, where Thomas's seat beside me was empty because he was dead, where Julian stood at the back of the hall with his arms crossed and his face carved from grief. A temporal echo. That was what Julian had called it. A moment where the two timelines overlapped, where the past that had been erased flickered into view like a ghost. I steadied my breathing and tried to focus on the lecture. Thomas, oblivious to my distress, was sketching something in the margin of his program. A horse, badly drawn but recognizable, with an absurdly long mane. He caught me looking and grinned. "For you," he said, tearing off the corner of the page and pressing it into my hand. "A masterpiece. You must treasure it always." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Thomas had this effect on people, this ability to make even the strangest moments feel lighter. In the other life, I had barely known him. He was the young master, someone I saw at a distance, someone whose moods and jokes were not my concern. But in this life, he treated me like a sister, with easy affection and casual intimacy, and I did not know how to reconcile the two versions of him. The ghost and the living man. After the lecture, we emerged into the weak afternoon sunlight. The street outside the Royal Society was crowded with carriages and well-dressed men discussing the talk in small clusters. Thomas offered me his arm, and we began walking toward where our own carriage waited. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of coal smoke and horse dung and the River Thames somewhere beyond the buildings. London in springtime, alive and dirty and indifferent to the impossible truths hidden beneath its surface. We were halfway to the carriage when I saw her. A woman in a dark gray dress, standing at the corner, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. She was perhaps 40, with a severe face and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I felt the same dizzying sensation I had experienced in the lecture hall. A flicker, a doubling, as if I were seeing two versions of her at once. In one version, she turned away and disappeared into the crowd. In the other, she stepped forward, her mouth opening to say something I could not hear over the noise of the street. Then the moment passed, and there was only one version. The woman walking away, her gray dress vanishing between the carriages. "Eleanor?" Thomas was looking at me with concern. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." I forced myself to nod. "The carriage ride, perhaps. I'm feeling a bit faint." He immediately became solicitous, guiding me toward the waiting carriage with exaggerated care. "Let's get you home. Mother will have my head if I let you collapse in the middle of Piccadilly." The ride back to Ashford Manor passed in a blur. Thomas chattered about the lecture, about his plans to visit friends in the country next month, about a new mare he was thinking of purchasing. I responded automatically, my mind elsewhere, turning over the temporal echoes I had experienced. They were getting stronger. The timelines were bleeding together. Whatever Julian was doing to stabilize the device, it was not enough. When we arrived home, I excused myself immediately and went in search of Julian. I found him not in the laboratory, but in the library, standing at the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the gardens with an expression of such profound weariness that I hesitated in the doorway. "Julian." He turned, and the weariness shifted into something more guarded. "Eleanor, how was the lecture?" I closed the door behind me and crossed to where he stood. I experienced the echoes. Twice. Once during the talk and once on the street. I saw the other timeline. I saw Thomas's empty seat. I saw you, alone and grieving. His jaw tightened. "The instability is worse than I thought." He set down the glass and ran a hand through his hair. "I've been monitoring the device all afternoon. The fluctuations are increasing. If this continues, the timeline will collapse within days, not weeks." The words settled over me like ice water. Days. We have days, at most. He met my eyes, and I saw the fear there, barely controlled. "I don't know how to fix it, Eleanor. Every adjustment I make seems to cause new problems. The machine was never designed for this. I exceeded its capabilities, and now we're paying the price." I stepped closer to him, drawn by the rawness in his voice. "What happens if it collapses? Do we simply wake up in the other timeline, or does something worse happen?" "I don't know." His honesty was brutal. The mechanics of temporal reversion are purely theoretical. We could revert cleanly with no memory of this timeline, or we could experience both timelines simultaneously, unable to distinguish between them. Or the paradox could destroy us entirely, unraveling our existence because we were made possible by a change that no longer exists. The possibilities hung between us, each one more terrifying than the last. I found myself reaching for his hand without thinking, needing the physical reality of him to anchor me against the vertigo of temporal instability. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, and for a moment we simply stood there, two people caught between worlds, holding on to each other because there was nothing else to hold on to. "I should never have done this," he said quietly. "I should have accepted Thomas's death. I should have grieved and moved on like a normal person. Instead, I damned us both." "You saved your brother," I replied. "That's not damnation. That's love." He looked at me with something like wonder. "How can you say that? You lost everything because of my arrogance. Your freedom, your choices, your life as you knew it. And now you might lose even this half-existence I trapped you in." "I did lose things," I agreed. "But I gained things too. I'm not a governess anymore, invisible and powerless. I'm a lady. I have a voice. I have you, even if we came together in the strangest way imaginable." I paused, gathering my courage. "In the other timeline, I loved you, Julian. Silently and hopelessly, but I loved you. And you never knew. You never saw me. So tell me, which is worse? A life where I loved you from a distance and you grieved yourself into an early grave? Or this life, where we're bound together by accident and terror and the desperate hope that we can make something real out of what was forced upon us?" His hand tightened on mine. "You loved me?" "Yes." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I loved you. I probably still do. I don't know if that's the governess's feelings or the wife's or some strange combination of both. But it's true." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he lifted his free hand and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. "I never saw you," he said, his voice rough. "In the other life, I was so consumed by my grief that I couldn't see anything else. I couldn't see that there was someone right there, someone kind and intelligent and patient, someone who might have helped me bear the weight if I had only looked. I was a fool." "You were grieving," I said softly. "That's not foolishness." "Perhaps. But I am not grieving now. Thomas is alive, and you are here, and despite everything, despite the temporal instability and the danger and the fact that our entire existence is built on a foundation that's crumbling beneath us, I find that I do not want to lose this. I do not want to lose you." The words shattered something inside me, some last defense I had been holding against him. I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing, and felt the warmth of his hand against my skin. "Even if the timeline collapses? Even if we revert to the way things were?" "Even then," he said, "because at least I will know. I will carry the memory of this, of you, of the strange gift we were given, even if we could not keep it. That has to count for something." I opened my eyes and found him looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was something different in his gaze now, something that had not been there before. Not the polite distance of a husband who married out of obligation, but genuine feeling, genuine connection. We were no longer strangers bound by temporal mechanics. We were two people who had chosen, in this moment, to reach for each other across the impossible divide. He leaned closer, his thumb brushing my cheekbone, and I could feel the question in the movement. A question I answered by rising on my toes and closing the remaining distance between us. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid the moment might shatter. But then his arm came around my waist, pulling me closer, and the tentative gentleness gave way to something deeper. Desperation, perhaps. Or relief. Or simply the human need to hold on to something real in a world that was coming apart at the seams. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I rested my forehead against his chest and felt his heartbeat beneath my cheek. For a moment, everything else fell away. The temporal echoes, the collapsing timeline, the impossible weight of living two lives at once. There was only this. Julian's arms around me, his warmth, his solid presence, the knowledge that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The moment could not last. Reality intruded in the form of voices in the corridor outside, Lady Ashford calling for someone, a servant hurrying past. Julian released me reluctantly, stepping back, his hand lingering on my arm. "We should go down for dinner," he said. "If we're absent, Mother will have questions." "Let her have questions," I replied. But I knew he was right. We could not hide in the library forever. We had roles to play, appearances to maintain. The illusion of normalcy, even as the world trembled on the edge of collapse. We descended to dinner together, and I felt the weight of Lady Ashford's gaze on us as we took our seats. She was too well bred to comment on my flushed cheeks or Julian's uncharacteristic presence at the table, but I saw the calculation in her eyes. She had noticed something. A shift in the dynamics between us, perhaps. A warmth that had not been there before. Thomas, blessedly oblivious, dominated the conversation with stories from the lecture and plans for the following week. He wanted to organize a hunting party, he said, invite some friends from university, show them the grounds. Julian listened with a patience I recognized as genuine affection, and I felt a pang of gratitude for the machine that had saved him. Whatever else Julian's device had done, whatever chaos it had created, it had given Thomas life. That had to count for something. After dinner, as the family dispersed to their various evening occupations, Julian caught my hand. "Come to the laboratory with me," he said quietly. "I need to run another diagnostic on the device, and I would feel better if you were there." I nodded, understanding what he was not saying. He did not want to be alone with the machine that was both his greatest achievement and his greatest failure. He did not want to face the possibility of losing everything without someone who understood, someone who remembered, someone who would mourn the same losses. The laboratory was cold and dim, lit only by the glow of the device in the center of the room. It hummed with that low, ominous sound I remembered from the morning. But there was something different about it now. A stutter in the rhythm, a hesitation, as if the machine itself was uncertain. Julian moved through the space with practiced efficiency, taking readings, making adjustments, muttering calculations under his breath. I stood near the door, watching him work, and tried not to think about what would happen if the device failed. Would I wake up in my narrow governess's room in the East Wing? Would I remember this life, this version of us, or would it be erased along with everything else? Would Julian grieve for Thomas again, alone and unreachable? The device gave a sudden, sharp whine, and Julian swore under his breath. The feedback loop is destabilizing. He moved quickly to another section of controls, his fingers flying over switches and dials. "Come here, Eleanor. I need you to hold this steady while I recalibrate." I crossed to him without hesitation, letting him guide my hands to a lever on the side of the machine. "Hold it exactly here," he said. "Don't let it move, no matter what happens." The metal was cold beneath my gloved fingers, and I could feel the vibration of the device through the lever, a pulse like a living heartbeat. Julian worked beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, his attention fixed on the machinery. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the hum of the device and Julian's quiet instructions. "Steady. Just a bit more. Almost there." Then something changed. The vibration beneath my hands intensified, and the air around us seemed to ripple. I felt a wave of dizziness, stronger than before, and suddenly I was seeing double. Two versions of the laboratory overlaid on each other. In one, Julian stood beside me, alive and focused and real. In the other, the laboratory was empty, the device silent, covered with dust and cobwebs, as if it had been abandoned for years. "Julian!" I gasped, but I could not hear my own voice over the whine of the machine. He looked at me, and his face went white. He could see it too. The doubling, the overlap, the two timelines bleeding together. For a moment, we hung suspended between them, neither fully in one world nor the other, and I understood with terrible clarity what would happen if the device failed completely. We would be torn apart, scattered across timelines, existing in neither place or both at once, ghosts haunting the ruins of our own lives. "Hold on," Julian shouted over the noise. "Don't let go of the lever." I gripped it tighter, my whole body shaking with the effort of holding steady against the temporal storm. Julian made one final adjustment, his movements desperate, and then he slammed his hand down on a large red switch at the center of the console. The machine went silent. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. I stood frozen, my hands still on the lever, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Slowly, the double vision faded. The laboratory resolved into a single image, one timeline, one reality. This one. Julian leaned against the console, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. "That was too close," he said hoarsely. "Another few seconds, and the paradox would have consumed us. What did you do?" My voice came out as a whisper. I shut it down. He met my eyes, and I saw the defeat there. The device is off. I cannot risk turning it back on, not until I understand what went wrong, but without it running, without the active stabilization field, the timeline will begin to decay naturally. He swallowed hard. We have maybe 48 hours before everything reverts. 2 days. We had 2 days before the world unraveled, and Thomas died, and I went back to being a governess, and Julian returned to his laboratory to grieve alone. 2 days before this strange, impossible marriage disappeared as if it had never been. I released the lever and stepped back, my legs unsteady. "Is there anything we can do?" Julian shook his head slowly. "I need time to analyze what happened, to understand the feedback loop. But time is the one thing we don't have." We stood in the silent laboratory, surrounded by the machine that had given us everything and was now taking it away, and I felt the weight of inevitability settle over me like a shroud. We had been living on borrowed time from the beginning, on a timeline that existed only because Julian had reached back and changed what could not be changed. And now the debt was coming due. Julian straightened, squaring his shoulders with visible effort. "Go to bed, Eleanor. There's nothing more we can do tonight. I'll stay here and work on the calculations." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "I'm not leaving you alone with this. We're in this together, remember?" He looked at me for a long moment, and then something in his expression softened. "Together," he repeated. He crossed to me and took my hands, his grip warm and steady. "Whatever happens, Eleanor, these 2 days we have left, I don't want to waste them in fear. If the timeline is going to collapse, if we're going to lose each other, then I want to spend the time we have being honest, being present, being something more than two people trapped by circumstance." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I don't want you to sleep in your room tonight." He pulled me closer, his voice dropping to something raw and vulnerable. "I want you with me, not as a wife who was forced upon me by temporal mechanics, but as a woman I choose, a woman I am choosing right now, with full knowledge of what we're facing." My breath caught. "You're sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything." He lifted one of my hands to his lips and kissed my knuckles through the thin silk of my glove. "I wasted one lifetime not seeing you, Eleanor. I will not waste what little time we have left." The words unraveled the last of my resistance. I let him lead me from the laboratory, through the dark corridors of Ashford Manor, to his room. Not the lady's bedroom where I had woken that morning, but the master's chamber, with its heavy furniture and the smell of leather and smoke and something indefinably him. He locked the door behind us and turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw not duty or obligation, but genuine desire, genuine connection, genuine choice. What followed was both tender and desperate, a claiming and a surrender, a joining of two people who knew they were living on borrowed time and were determined to make every moment count. In the darkness, with Julian's hands on my skin and his whispered words in my ear, the temporal paradox and the failing device and the threat of losing everything faded into insignificance. There was only this, only us, only the choice we were making to reach for each other even as the world prepared to tear us apart. Afterward, lying in his arms with my head on his chest, I listened to his heartbeat and tried to memorize the feeling. The warmth of his skin, the weight of his arm around my waist, the rise and fall of his breathing. If we had only 48 hours, then I would carry this memory with me into whatever came next. The knowledge that, for one brief moment, we had been chosen. We had been real. "Julian," I whispered into the darkness, "if we revert, if we go back to the other timeline, will you look for me?" He tightened his arms around me. "I will spend every day looking for you," he promised. "Even if I don't remember this, even if the timeline erases everything, I will find you." Somehow, it was an impossible promise, but I believed him, because some connections, some bonds, were stronger than time itself, and what we had found in the space between two timelines was worth fighting for, even if the fight was doomed from the start. I closed my eyes and let myself drift towards sleep, held safe in the arms of the man I loved, in a world that would not exist by the time the week ended. Tomorrow, we would face the calculations and the desperate search for a solution. Tomorrow, we would confront the reality of temporal decay and the price of changing the past. But tonight, we had each other. And in the midst of chaos and impossible choices and the slow unraveling of reality, that would have to be enough. I woke to gray morning light filtering through unfamiliar curtains and the realization that I had slept in Julian's bed, in Julian's arms, in a timeline that had perhaps 36 hours left to exist. He was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful in a way I had never seen it, the lines of exhaustion smoothed away by unconsciousness. I watched him for a long moment, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the dark sweep of his lashes against his cheek, the way his hand rested on the pillow between us as if reaching for me even in sleep. Then reality crashed back in, and I slipped carefully from the bed, gathering my scattered clothes, trying not to wake him. He needed the rest. We both did. But there was no time for rest, not really. Every hour that passed brought us closer to the moment when this timeline would collapse and we would lose everything we had found. I dressed quickly in the dim light and made my way back to my own room through the silent corridors. The house was not yet awake, the servants still below stairs preparing for the day, the family still abed. I felt like a ghost moving through the manor, caught between worlds, existing in a space that was already beginning to fade. My maid found me an hour later, already dressed and sitting at the window, watching the sun rise over the gardens. She seemed surprised to find me awake so early, but said nothing, simply helped me arrange my hair and brought me tea. I dismissed her as soon as I could and made my way down to breakfast, where I found Lady Ashford already seated, reading her correspondence with the same cool efficiency she brought to everything. She looked up as I entered, and I saw the assessment in her eyes, the slight narrowing, the way her gaze traveled over me as if searching for evidence of something she suspected but could not name. "Good morning, Eleanor. You're up early." "I could not sleep," I said, taking my seat and accepting tea from the footman. The truth, at least partially. Lady Ashford folded her letter with precise movements. Julian was absent from his room last night. The servants noticed. She paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. I trust there is no cause for concern. The statement was a question, a probe, a reminder that she was the mistress of this house, and nothing escaped her notice. I met her gaze steadily. Julian was working in his laboratory. I kept him company for a time. Surely there is nothing unusual in a wife spending time with her husband. Of course not. But her tone suggested she did not entirely believe me. You must understand, Eleanor, that appearances matter, especially now when your position in this family is still, shall we say, being established. There are those who question the match from the beginning. An unknown governess elevated so suddenly to Lady Ashford. It invites speculation. The words were a carefully aimed dart, a reminder of my origins, of the fact that in this timeline, I had been brought into the family through channels Lady Ashford still did not entirely approve of. But there was something else beneath the criticism, something I had not heard before. Uncertainty. As if she were not quite sure of the history she was recounting, as if the facts were slippery in her mind. I watched her carefully. Do you remember the wedding? Lady Ashford? 6 months ago? She blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face before she smoothed it away. Of course I remember. It was here at the manor. A small ceremony, appropriate for the circumstances. She paused, her fingers tightening on her teacup. Why do you ask? I was simply curious. It feels like so long ago. Yes. She set down her cup with a faint click of porcelain. Yes, it does. Almost as if it were another life entirely. The words chilled me. Lady Ashford did not carry the double memories the way Julian and I did, but she was experiencing something. A sense of wrongness, of temporal displacement, of facts that did not quite align with her intuition. The timeline was decaying, and she could feel it even if she did not understand what she was feeling. Thomas arrived then, bright and cheerful, and utterly oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. He kissed his mother's cheek, clapped me on the shoulder with brotherly affection, and proceeded to dominate the conversation with plans for his hunting party. I was grateful for the distraction, for the way his energy filled the space and drove away the shadows. But I caught Lady Ashford watching me several times during the meal, her expression troubled, and I knew we were running out of time in more ways than one. After breakfast, I went directly to the laboratory. Julian was already there, bent over his calculations, his hair uncombed and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He looked up as I entered, and something in his expression softened. Eleanor, I hoped you would come. I crossed to him, and he pulled me close, his arms coming around me with a desperation that spoke to the fear we both carried. For a moment, we simply held each other, drawing strength from the physical reality of touch, of warmth, of presence. Then he released me and gestured to the papers scattered across his workbench. I've been working on a solution. His voice was hoarse. There might be a way to stabilize the timeline without the device running continuously. If I can create a closed temporal loop, a self-sustaining paradox, it would anchor the changes without requiring external energy input. Can you do it? He hesitated. Theoretically, yes, but it would require another intervention in the past. A second alteration, carefully calibrated to reinforce the first. He ran a hand through his hair. The problem is that I can't predict all the consequences. Changing the past once already created this situation. Changing it again could make things worse, or it could work. I simply don't know. What kind of intervention? Julian pulled out a sheaf of papers covered in equations and diagrams. The instability stems from the fact that Thomas's survival created a causality gap. In the original timeline, his death was a fixed point, an event that influenced everything that came after. By preventing it, I created a void that the timeline keeps trying to fill. The machine was acting as a bridge across that void. But it's not enough. I need to create a new fixed point, something equally significant that locks the altered timeline in place. Like what? He met my eyes, and I saw the conflict there. Like a birth, or a death, or a marriage that was always meant to happen, not forced by temporal mechanics, but chosen freely, witnessed by others, anchored in social and legal reality in a way that cannot be easily erased. Understanding dawned slowly. You want to remarry me, not in the timeline created by the machine, but in the original past. You want to go back and make sure we were always meant to be together. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. If I can go back to before Thomas's accident, before any of this began, and set in motion the events that would lead to our marriage naturally, it would create a stable loop. Thomas's survival would no longer be an anomaly, because it would occur in a timeline where we were already connected, where the causality web was already rewoven around us. I stared at him, my mind racing. But that would mean changing more than Thomas's accident. That would mean changing the entire trajectory of our lives. How would you even accomplish it? He turned to a different set of calculations, his finger tracing a line of equations. I would have to go back 3 years, to the point where you first came to Ashford Manor as a governess. Instead of allowing events to unfold as they did originally, I would need to ensure that I noticed you, that we formed a connection, that the path to marriage was laid naturally over time. He looked at me, his expression anguished. But Eleanor, I cannot do this without your consent. This would not be a passive change like the first one. This would be active manipulation of your life, of your choices, of your past. I would be ensuring that you fell in love with me, that you agreed to marry me, that you gave up your independence and your future for a life with me. Even if I do it in a way that appears natural, even if you never know you were influenced, it's still a violation of your autonomy. The weight of what he was proposing settled over me. He was offering to rewrite our entire history, to create a world where we had always loved each other, where our marriage was real from the beginning. But in doing so, he would be taking away my choice. The governess who came to Ashford Manor 3 years ago would never have the chance to decide for herself whether she wanted this life. She would be guided, subtly and carefully, into falling in love with a man who was manipulating events from the future. How would you do it? I asked quietly. How would you make me fall in love with you? Julian pulled out another paper, and I saw that he had already worked out the details with the same meticulous care he brought to all his scientific endeavors. Small interventions. I would engage you in conversation when previously I ignored you. I would notice your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I would create opportunities for us to spend time together. I would let you see past the grief and the obsession to the man I might have been if Thomas had lived. Over months, over years, a genuine connection would form. And by the time Thomas's accident approached, we would be engaged. Our marriage would be planned. And when I used the device to save him, it would be in a timeline where we were already committed to each other. So the machine would still be used, Thomas would still be saved, but we would already be in love when it happened. Yes, and that would create the stability we need. The timeline would not be trying to erase our marriage because our marriage would have existed before the intervention, not as a result of it. I walked to the window and looked out at the gardens, trying to process what he was asking. It was elegant, in a way. A solution that saved Thomas and stabilized the timeline and kept us together. But it was also profoundly manipulative. The Eleanor of 3 years ago would have no idea that the man courting her was acting on knowledge from a failed future, that every kind word and gentle gesture was calculated to produce a specific outcome. Would you tell me? I turned back to him. In that new past, would you tell me the truth about what you were doing? Eventually. His voice was strained. Once we were married, once the timeline was stable, I would tell you everything. I would give you the choice then to stay or leave, knowing what I had done. And if I chose to leave, then I would let you go, and Thomas would still be alive, and the timeline would still be stable. But I would lose you. He crossed to me, taking my hands in his. I know what I'm asking is wrong, Eleanor. I know I have no right to manipulate your past, but I am desperate. I cannot lose Thomas again, and I cannot lose you. Not now, not after finally seeing you, finally knowing what we could be together. A sharp pain lanced through my temple and I gasped, pressing my hand to my head. Julian steadied me, his face going pale. Eleanor, what is it? Temporal echo. The room was doubling again, 2 versions overlaying each other. In one version, we stood in the laboratory discussing impossible choices. In the other, the laboratory was empty and cold, and through the window I could see a funeral procession making its way across the grounds. Thomas's funeral. The timeline that would return if we did nothing. The vision faded, and I found myself leaning heavily against Julian, my breath coming in short gasps. "It's getting worse," I said. "The decay is accelerating." He supported me to a chair and knelt beside me, his hands gripping mine. "We're running out of time faster than I calculated. Eleanor, I need your answer. Do I have your permission to go back and rewrite our past?" I looked into his eyes and saw the fear there, the desperate hope, the guilt over what he was proposing. And I understood that this was not really a choice between manipulation and freedom. It was a choice between letting the timeline collapse and losing everything, or accepting a past that would be rewritten to save both Thomas and our marriage. The governess of 3 years ago would lose her autonomy. But that version of me no longer existed. She had already been erased once when the timeline shifted. What I was deciding now was whether to allow her to be erased again. But this time with intention, with purpose, with the knowledge that it would create something lasting. "Do it," I said. "Go back and make us fall in love. Save Thomas and save us. I will bear the guilt of manipulating my past self if it means we get to keep this." Julian's eyes closed briefly, relief and anguish warring across his face. "Thank you." He rose and pulled me to my feet, his arms coming around me. "I will do everything I can to make it right. I will make her happy, Eleanor. I will make sure that version of you has a good life, a real marriage, genuine love. Even if I'm engineering it from the outside, I will make it as real as I possibly can. I believe you." I rested my forehead against his chest. "When will you go?" "Now, while I still have the power to run the device one more time." He released me and moved to the machine, his hands already reaching for the controls. "I need you to wait here. If the intervention works, if I successfully create the new timeline, you should feel the shift. The memories will reorganize. This version of events will fade, and the new past will take its place." His voice broke slightly. "You may not remember this conversation. You may not remember these last 2 days, but somewhere, beneath the new memories, the truth will remain. Hold on to it if you can. What about you? Will you remember? I'll remember everything. That's the burden of being the one who operates the machine. I carry all the timelines." He looked at me with such intensity that I felt it like a physical touch. "Whatever happens, Eleanor, know that I love you. Not because a machine forced us together, not because temporal mechanics demanded it, but because you are brave and kind and remarkable, and I am honored to know you, to have been seen by you, even in these strange circumstances." The words broke something open in my chest. I crossed to him and kissed him, pouring everything I felt into the contact. Love and fear and gratitude and grief for the life we were about to lose, and hope for the life we might create. When we finally broke apart, I could see tears on his cheeks, or perhaps they were on mine. It was impossible to tell where one of us ended and the other began. He turned to the machine and began the activation sequence. The device hummed to life, building from a low vibration to a high, keening sound that made my teeth ache. The air began to shimmer, reality bending around the brass and glass and copper coils. Julian made adjustments, his movements swift and sure, despite the trembling in his hands. "Remember that I love you," he said, without looking away from the controls. And then he threw the final switch. The world exploded into white light. I felt myself torn apart and reassembled, memories fragmenting and reforming, timelines colliding and separating. I was the governess arriving at Ashford Manor for the first time, nervous and hopeful. I was the same governess months later, engaged in conversation with Dr. Ashford in the library, surprised by his attention, flattered by his interest. I was a woman falling in love, slowly, naturally, over years of careful courtship. I was a bride standing in the chapel, speaking vows I meant with my whole heart to a man I had chosen freely. I was all of these things at once, and I was none of them. And I was myself standing in the laboratory, watching reality rewrite itself around me. The light faded. The machine powered down. I stood alone in the laboratory, swaying slightly, my head spinning with the weight of reorganized memories. Julian was gone. Of course he was gone. He had sent himself back 3 years. He was in the past now, beginning the careful work of rewriting our history. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to sort through the confusion in my mind. I remembered being a governess. I remembered Julian ignoring me. But I also remembered something else. Julian smiling at me in a corridor. Julian asking my opinion on a book. Julian inviting me to join the family for dinner. Small moments, growing over months into something more. A courtship, an engagement, a wedding that was real and chosen and witnessed by everyone we knew. The new memories were settling in, pushing aside the old ones, creating a past that had never existed until this moment. And yet, beneath it all, I still remembered the other timelines. The grief and the machine and the desperate 48 hours when we had loved each other while the world fell apart. Julian had been right. The burden of operating the machine meant he would carry all the timelines. But apparently, being present at the moment of temporal intervention meant I carried them too. I walked through the manor in a daze, my mind trying to reconcile 3 years of new history with the knowledge of what had really happened. The house looked the same but felt different. There were small changes, a portrait in the hallway that had not been there before, different curtains in the drawing room, evidence of a timeline where I had been lady of the house for years, not days. I found Thomas in the music room, playing the piano with more enthusiasm than skill. He looked up as I entered and grinned. "Eleanor, come to save us from my musical tortures?" Julian's hiding in the library pretending to read, but I know he's just avoiding my practice session. The casual affection in his voice was the same, but the context was different. In this timeline, I was not a stranger who had suddenly appeared as his brother's wife. I was his sister by marriage of 3 years, someone he had known and liked from the beginning, someone who belonged. "Where is Julian?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Library," as I said. "He's been odd today, quieter than usual." Thomas hit a particularly discordant note and winced. "I think he's worrying about his research again. You should go talk to him. You always know how to settle his mind." I left Thomas to his practice and made my way to the library. I found Julian exactly where Thomas had said, sitting by the window with a book open in his lap, staring at nothing. He looked up as I entered and I saw the relief flood his face. "Eleanor." His voice was rough with emotion. "You remember?" It was not a question. He could see in my eyes that I carried the memories, all of them, the tangled web of timelines we had lived through. I crossed to him, and he stood, pulling me into his arms with a force that spoke to his fear that I might not be real. We clung to each other in the quiet library while afternoon light streamed through the windows. 2 people who had rewritten history and somehow managed to remain themselves in the process. "It worked," he said into my hair. "The timeline is stable. Thomas is alive. We're married, truly married, with a history that makes sense to everyone who knows us. And you're here. You're real. You remember. I remember everything." I pulled back enough to look at him. Did you do what you said? Did you make me fall in love with you?" His eyes were haunted. I tried. "I spent 3 years trying to be the man you deserved, trying to earn your love honestly, even though I knew how it would end. And the strange thing is, Eleanor, I don't think I had to manipulate anything. Once I allowed myself to see you, once I opened myself to the possibility, everything else followed naturally. You are extraordinary. Anyone would fall in love with you if they simply paid attention. So, our marriage is real. Not forced by the machine, but chosen by both of us, over time, with full hearts, as real as I could make it. He touched my face with infinite gentleness. But you need to know that I still carry the guilt. The governess who came here 3 years ago, she never had the chance to live a life without my interference. I altered her path the moment I went back. Even if she ended up happy, even if she chose me freely in the end, her choices were still shaped by my foreknowledge. Then we carry that guilt together, I said firmly. Because I agreed to this, I gave you permission. And if the cost of saving Thomas and stabilizing the timeline was that my past self's path was gently guided toward this outcome, then I accept that cost. She is me. I am her. And I am happy, Julian. Even knowing everything, I am happy with the life we built. He searched my face, looking for certainty, for forgiveness, for absolution. And whatever he saw there must have been enough because he kissed me, soft and reverent, a kiss that tasted like relief and sorrow and hope all mingled together. We were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lady Ashford entered without waiting for permission, her expression troubled. "Julian, Eleanor, I need to speak with you both." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I have been experiencing the most peculiar sensation all day. As if I am forgetting something important. As if the world is not quite as I remember it." She looked between us, her eyes sharp despite her confusion. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Julian and I exchanged a glance. In this timeline, we had been married for 3 years. We had a history, a relationship, a shared life that Lady Ashford had witnessed from the beginning. But she was experiencing echoes of the other timelines, fragments of memories that did not align with the reality she thought she knew. "Mother," Julian said carefully, "sometimes we all experience moments of confusion. Perhaps you need rest." She shook her head impatiently. "This is not confusion. This is knowledge. Knowledge that something has changed, something fundamental." She looked directly at me. "Eleanor, do you feel it too?" I could not lie to her. Not directly. "Yes," I said quietly. "I feel it." Lady Ashford nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Then tell me what has happened. What has my son done?" Julian tensed beside me, but I placed a hand on his arm. "She deserves the truth, or at least as much of it as she can understand." So we told her. Sitting in the library as the afternoon faded into evening, we explained as gently as we could about Thomas's death in the original timeline, about the machine Julian had built, about the temporal intervention that had saved him. We told her about the unstable first attempt and the collapse that had threatened to undo everything. We did not tell her about the rewritten courtship, about the manipulation of my past. Some secrets were too heavy to share. Lady Ashford listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When we finished, she sat for a long time without speaking. Then, finally, she said, "Thomas died." "Yes," Julian said. "In another timeline, another life, he died. And I could not accept it. So you changed the past. You brought him back." She looked at her son with an expression I could not read. Anger, perhaps, or awe, or terror at what he had accomplished. "And in doing so, you risked everything. Your life, your sanity, the stability of reality itself." "Yes." She turned to me. "And you, Eleanor. You went along with this madness. I love them both," I said simply. "Thomas deserves to live, and Julian deserves not to carry the weight of grief alone. So yes, I went along with it. I would do it again." Lady Ashford rose and walked to the window, her back to us. For a long moment she simply stood there, looking out at the gardens where her younger son was, alive and whole, because her older son had refused to accept the unacceptable. When she finally turned back to us, there were tears on her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving him. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, thank you for giving me back my son." Julian rose and went to her, and she collapsed into his arms, weeping with a grief she could only partially remember, mourning a death that had been erased but whose shadow still lingered. I watched them and felt the weight of everything we had done settle fully into place. We had changed the past, we had saved a life, and we would carry the consequences of that choice for the rest of our days. But Thomas was alive, and Julian and I had found each other. And somehow, against all odds and logic and the fundamental rules of causality, we had created a timeline that might actually last. The device sat silent in the laboratory, its work complete. We would never use it again. Julian had already begun making plans to dismantle it, to destroy the schematics, to ensure that no one else could attempt what he had done. The risk was too great, the cost too high. But for now, in this moment, in this timeline, we were together, all of us. The Ashford family, complete and whole, held together by science and love and the desperate courage of a man who had reached back through time and rewritten destiny itself. It would have to be enough. The weeks that followed the temporal intervention settled into a strange new normalcy. I woke each morning in the room I shared with Julian. In the bed we had shared for 3 years according to the timeline, but only weeks according to my fragmented memory. I remembered our wedding as both a hasty arrangement forced by temporal mechanics and a joyful ceremony that had taken months to plan. I remembered my first day at Ashford Manor as both an invisible governess and a young woman who had caught the eye of the brilliant, grieving Dr. Ashford. I carried 3 lives in my head, and some mornings I could not tell which version of myself I was meant to be. Julian bore the weight better than I did, perhaps because he had prepared himself for it. He had known from the beginning that operating the device would leave him with memories of all possible timelines, layers of reality stacked one atop the other like translucent sheets of glass. But even he had moments when the burden showed. I would find him standing at windows, staring at nothing, his expression distant and haunted. Once, I came upon him in Thomas's room, watching his brother sleep, and the look on his face was one of such profound relief and terror that I had to turn away to give him privacy with his emotions. We did not speak of it directly. What was there to say? We had changed the past and saved a life and created a marriage out of nothing, and now we had to live with the consequences of playing God with causality. Some nights, Julian held me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I knew he was reassuring himself that I was real, that I had not been erased or lost in the temporal shifts. Other nights, I woke to find him gone, returned to the laboratory where the dismantled device sat like the skeleton of something that should never have been born. But there were good moments too, moments when the weight lifted and we could simply exist as husband and wife, as 2 people who had chosen each other even if the circumstances of that choice were impossibly complicated. We took walks through the gardens, and Julian told me about his research into electromagnetic fields, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. We attended the theater, and I felt the warmth of his hand in mine as we watched the actors spin their dramatic tales, so much simpler than our own. We hosted dinners, and I played the role of Lady Ashford with a confidence I had not possessed in the first unstable timeline, bolstered by 3 years of false memories that had nevertheless taught me how to be the woman this position required. Thomas was thriving. That was the miracle that made everything else bearable. He rode out each morning, his laughter carrying across the grounds. He flirted with young ladies at society gatherings and made plans to travel to the continent in the summer. He lived fully and joyfully, with no memory of the death he had escaped. Sometimes I caught him looking at Julian with an expression of puzzlement, as if he sensed something was different about his brother, but could not name what it was. But those moments passed quickly, and Thomas returned to his natural exuberance, unaware of the weight Julian carried for him. It was 6 weeks after the final intervention when the letter arrived. I was at breakfast with Lady Ashford and Thomas when the footman brought in the morning post on a silver tray. Julian had already left for the laboratory, muttering something about a calculation he needed to verify. I sorted through the usual correspondence, invitations and social notices and letters from acquaintances, until I came to one addressed to Dr. Julian Ashford in an official hand. The seal was from the Royal Society. I felt a chill run through me and set the letter aside, finishing my breakfast with mechanical politeness while my mind raced through possibilities. The Royal Society knew of Julian's work in electromagnetic theory. They had invited him to present papers, but they did not know about the device, about the temporal experiments, about what he had accomplished. At least, they should not know. After breakfast, I took the letter directly to the laboratory. Julian was bent over his workbench, examining what looked like a circuit diagram, his hair falling into his eyes. He looked up as I entered and smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that still made my heart catch. "Eleanor, I was just thinking about you. Were you?" I crossed to him and held out the letter. This arrived with the Morning Post. His smile faded as he saw the Royal Society seal. He took the letter and broke it open, his eyes moving rapidly across the page. As he read, I watched the color drain from his face. "What is it?" He handed me the letter without a word. I scanned the contents quickly, my heart sinking with each line. The Royal Society was requesting a formal investigation into allegations that Dr. Julian Ashford had been conducting unauthorized temporal experiments. An anonymous source had provided information suggesting that Julian possessed a device capable of manipulating causality itself. The Society demanded that Julian present himself and any relevant materials for review within the week. Who could have sent this? I looked up at him, searching his face for answers. No one knew about the device except us and your mother. Julian shook his head slowly. "I don't know. The device was dismantled. The schematics are locked in my personal safe, unless someone saw something, heard something during the interventions." He ran a hand through his hair, agitation making his movements sharp. Temporal disturbances on that scale. They might have been detectable by sensitive enough instruments. If someone at the Society was monitoring electromagnetic fluctuations, they might have noticed anomalies. "What will you do?" He looked at me, and I saw the fear beneath his controlled exterior. "If I present the device to the Royal Society, if I admit what I've done, they will either declare me mad or they will demand access to the technology. And if they gain access, Eleanor, if other men learn how to change the past, the consequences could be catastrophic. We barely stabilized one intervention. Imagine dozens of people altering history to suit their desires. It would tear reality apart. Then don't admit anything. Deny it all. Tell them the anonymous source was mistaken or malicious. They're the Royal Society. They have resources, authority, connections to the government. If they believe I've developed technology this significant, they won't simply accept a denial." He began pacing, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "I need to destroy everything. Not just dismantle the device, but eliminate every trace of it. Burn the papers, melt down the components, remove any evidence that it ever existed." "And the memories?" I asked quietly. "Can you destroy those too?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with such anguish that I crossed to him immediately, taking his hands. "The memories are the proof that we succeeded," he said, "that Thomas is alive because of what we did. But they're also evidence of the greatest crime against natural law ever committed. If someone found a way to extract those memories, to prove what happened, they could use them to build their own device. No one can extract memories, Julian. That's impossible. Now it's impossible." He met my eyes. "But I created a machine that changes the past. What else might be possible that we simply haven't imagined yet?" The weight of his paranoia, his fear of what he had unleashed, settled over us both. We stood in the laboratory surrounded by the remnants of his greatest achievement, and I understood that we would never be free of this. The device might be dismantled, the timeline might be stable, but the knowledge of what could be done would haunt us for the rest of our lives. A knock at the laboratory door made us both jump. Lady Ashford entered without waiting for permission. her face grave. "Julian, Eleanor, I've just received a visit from Sir Edmund Whitmore. He's on the governing board of the Royal Society." She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "He asked me several pointed questions about your recent work, about whether you had been conducting unusual experiments, whether there had been any strange occurrences in the house. What did you tell him?" Julian's voice was tight. "I told him nothing, of course, but he seemed quite convinced that something significant had occurred." She looked between us. "He mentioned temporal anomalies detected across London 6 weeks ago, disturbances in the electromagnetic field that several researchers noticed simultaneously. They've been investigating the source ever since. 6 weeks ago. The final intervention." Julian's face went gray. "They have physical evidence of the temporal disturbance. Sir Edmund suggested that if you cooperated voluntarily, the investigation would be handled discreetly. But if you refused, they would be forced to involve government authorities." She straightened her shoulders, every inch the aristocratic matriarch. "I do not care what you have done, Julian. You are my son. But I need to know what we are facing." Julian looked at me, then at his mother, and I saw the moment he made his decision. "We need to tell Thomas. If this investigation proceeds, if they dig deeply enough into the timeline anomalies, he might start asking questions. He deserves to know the truth before he hears it from strangers." Lady Ashford paled. "You want to tell him that he died? That you changed the past to save him? He needs to understand why we're about to fight to keep my research private." Julian's voice was firm despite the tremor in his hands. "And he needs to know while we still control the narrative." Thomas was in the stables when we found him, grooming his favorite mare with the patient care he brought to everything involving horses. He looked up as we approached, his smile fading as he saw our expressions. "Whatever this is, it looks dire. Has someone died?" The bitter irony of the question hung in the air. Julian glanced at me, and I nodded encouragement. Together, we told him. About the accident that had killed him in the original timeline. About Julian's grief and obsession, and the device he had built. About the intervention that had saved Thomas's life and rewritten our entire history. About the new timeline and the memories we carried and the investigation that now threatened to expose everything. Thomas listened in silence, his hand stilling on the mare's neck. When we finished, he simply stood there for a long moment, processing. Then he said, "I died." "Yes," Julian said quietly, "and you brought me back." "Yes." Thomas looked at his brother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Gravity, perhaps, or the first real understanding of mortality. "How long do I have?" "In this timeline, I mean. If the machine is destroyed, if the timeline collapses, do I go back to being dead?" "The timeline is stable," I said quickly. "What Julian did worked. You're not going to disappear, Thomas. You're real. This is your life now. But I wasn't supposed to have it." He met my eyes, and I saw genuine fear there beneath his usual cheerfulness. "This life, it's not mine by right. It's stolen, borrowed, built on something unnatural. It's yours because your brother loved you too much to let you go," I said firmly. "Nothing about love is unnatural, Thomas. Nothing about fighting for the people we care about is wrong." He looked at Julian again, and something shifted in his expression. "You did this for me. You risked everything, your sanity, your marriage, the stability of reality itself, all to save me." "You're my brother," Julian said simply. "What else would I have done?" Thomas crossed to Julian and pulled him into a fierce embrace. The two brothers stood in the stable holding each other while the horses shifted in their stalls, and I turned away to give them privacy. When they finally separated, Thomas's eyes were red, but his jaw was set with determination. "So what do we do?" he asked. "How do we protect what you've built?" "We deny everything," Julian said. "We destroy all evidence. And we face the Royal Society with absolute conviction that they are mistaken." He looked at his brother. "But Thomas, you need to understand. If this goes badly, if they push hard enough, I might face charges. Fraud, at the very least. Possibly dangerous experimentation. You and Mother and Eleanor could be implicated by association." "Then we stand together," Thomas said without hesitation. "All of us, whatever comes." That night, Julian burned his papers. I stood beside him in the laboratory as he fed years of research into the fire, watching equations and diagrams turn to ash. He had already dismantled the core components of the device and melted them down to unrecognizable metal. The laboratory that had once hummed with impossible machinery now looked like any gentleman's research space, filled with conventional equipment and innocent experiments. When the last paper had burned, Julian slumped against the workbench, exhausted. "It's gone," he said hoarsely. "All of it. The only proof that remains is in our memories. And those they cannot take from us," I said, wrapping my arms around him. "We'll face this investigation together, Julian. The entire family. We'll protect what you've done." He turned in my embrace and kissed me, desperate and grateful and afraid. "I love you," he whispered against my lips. "In every timeline, in every version of events, I love you. I love you too." I held him close, feeling his heart beat against mine. "And we will survive this. We've survived everything else." The following morning, Julian presented himself at the Royal Society. I insisted on accompanying him, and Thomas and Lady Ashford came as well. We made an impressive family group, united and dignified, showing no sign of the fear that gnawed at all of us. Sir Edmund Whitmore received us in his office, a space lined with books and scientific instruments. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted us with cold courtesy and gestured to the seats arranged before his desk. "Dr. Ashford," he began without preamble, "we have credible evidence of temporal disturbances originating from your estate 6 weeks ago. Multiple researchers detected electromagnetic anomalies consistent with large-scale causality manipulation." He leaned forward. "I will be direct. Have you developed a device capable of altering the past?" Julian met his gaze without flinching. "I have conducted research into electromagnetic fields and their theoretical relationship to temporal mechanics. But a device capable of changing the past? That remains purely theoretical. The disturbances you detected were likely from experimental work that did not yield the results you imagine." Sir Edmund's expression hardened. "We have more than just electromagnetic readings, Dr. Ashford. We have testimonies from your household staff, reports of strange occurrences, your own wife appearing disoriented and confused about basic facts of her life, your brother experiencing unexplained gaps in memory." He pulled out a file and opened it. "We have documentation suggesting that your marriage to Lady Eleanor occurred under circumstances that several witnesses find difficult to recall with clarity." My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. I spoke before Julian could respond. "Sir Edmund, I must object to this characterization. My marriage to Julian is completely legitimate and well documented. If there have been moments of confusion in my household, they are the result of the strain of managing a large estate, nothing more." Lady Ashford added her voice, cool and aristocratic. "You are making serious accusations based on the gossip of servants and the misinterpretation of scientific experiments. My son is a brilliant researcher. I will not have his reputation damaged by speculation and rumor." Sir Edmund looked between us, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the strength of his evidence against the social and political weight of the Ashford family. We sat in charged silence, and I felt the future balanced on a knife's edge. Finally, Sir Edmund closed the file. "Dr. Ashford, I will be frank. If you have accomplished what we suspect, it represents either the greatest scientific achievement in human history or the greatest threat to the stability of reality. Either way, the Royal Society and the Crown have an obligation to investigate." He paused. "However, I am also a practical man. If the device has been destroyed, if there is no possibility of the technology being replicated or misused, then perhaps this matter can be resolved quietly, for the good of all involved. The device, if it ever existed, no longer does, Julian said carefully. And I give you my word as a gentleman and a scientist that I will not pursue this line of research further. Whatever theoretical work I may have done is concluded. Sir Edmund studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. The investigation will be closed with a notation that no evidence of improper experimentation was found. But Dr. Ashford, understand this. You will be watched. Any hint that you have resumed this work, any suggestion that you are attempting to manipulate temporal mechanics, and the full weight of the Royal Society and the government will come down upon you. There will be no second chances. I understand, Julian said. We left the Royal Society in silence, not speaking until we were safely in our carriage. Then Thomas let out a shaky laugh. That was the most terrifying negotiation I've ever witnessed, and I wasn't even the one doing the talking. Julian leaned back against the seat, his face gray with exhaustion. It's over. They'll watch me, but as long as I do nothing suspicious, they'll leave us alone. Lady Ashford reached across and squeezed his hand. You saved your brother, and you protected your family. Whatever else happens, whatever guilt you carry, remember that. I took Julian's other hand and held it tight, and we rode home through the London streets as the afternoon faded into evening. The device was destroyed, the investigation was closed, our timeline was stable, and our family was safe. But the knowledge of what had been done, what could be done, would follow us always. That night, lying in Julian's arms, I felt the weight of all our timelines pressing down on me. The governess who had loved hopelessly, the wife created by temporal mechanics, the woman who had been courted over 3 years that existed only in rewritten memory. All of them were me. All of them were real, and all of them loved the man beside me who had reached back through time and changed everything for the sake of his brother. We would carry these memories for the rest of our lives. The burden and the gift of knowing that reality was not fixed, that the past could be changed, that love and grief and desperate courage could reshape the world itself. It was a terrible knowledge and a beautiful one, and it bound us together more surely than any vow. In the darkness, Julian whispered, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" I thought about everything we had endured, everything we had risked, everything we had lost and gained. "No," I said finally. "I regret nothing. We saved Thomas. We found each other. We created something real out of impossible circumstances. That's enough." He held me tighter, and I felt him relax, some of the tension finally leaving his body. Tomorrow we would face the ordinary challenges of life in the stable timeline. But tonight, we simply existed. 2 people who had bent time itself and somehow survived with our hearts intact. It would have to be enough. And somehow, improbably, it was. Autumn came to Ashford Manor with its usual melancholy beauty. The gardens turned gold and crimson, the air grew sharp with the promise of winter, and the household settled into the rhythms of the season. It had been 4 months since the Royal Society investigation, 4 months since Julian destroyed the device, and we closed the door on the possibility of ever changing the past again. 4 months of living in our stable timeline, watching Thomas thrive, playing our roles as husband and wife, carrying the weight of memories that no one else could understand. I thought I had made peace with everything. I thought the questions had been answered, the choices accepted, the impossible circumstances folded into the fabric of our daily lives. But peace, I was learning, was not a destination, but a practice. And some questions returned in the quiet hours, when the house was dark and sleep would not come, insistent and unrelenting. It was on such a night that I found myself standing at the window of our bedroom, watching the moon cast silver light across the grounds. Julian was asleep behind me, his breathing deep and even, undisturbed by the thoughts that kept me wakeful. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and let the question I had been avoiding surface fully into consciousness. How much of what I felt was real, and how much was written into me by temporal mechanics? I loved Julian. That much I knew with certainty. But which version of me loved him? The governess who had watched him from a distance, whose feelings had grown naturally in silence? Or the wife created by the machine, whose memories of courtship and romance had been manufactured after the fact? Or the woman who had lived through the collapsing timeline, who had chosen to let her past be rewritten, who had agreed to manipulation for the sake of saving Thomas and preserving our marriage? All three versions existed in my mind, layered and tangled. But which one was me? And if I could not answer that question, how could I trust that anything I felt was genuine? I did not hear Julian wake, did not notice him leave the bed until his arms came around me from behind, his warmth pressing against my back. "You're thinking too loudly," he murmured into my hair. "I can feel it, even in my sleep." I leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Tell me." His voice was gentle but firm. "Whatever thoughts are keeping you awake, share them with me." For a moment, I could not speak. The words felt too dangerous, too likely to shatter the fragile peace we had built. But Julian deserved my honesty. He had given me everything, risked everything, and I owed him the truth of my doubts. How do I know what I feel is real? The question came out barely above a whisper. How do I know I love you because I chose to, and not because you rewrote the past to make me love you? Julian went very still behind me. Then, slowly, he turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. His eyes in the moonlight were dark and serious, and filled with a pain I recognized. Because I have asked myself the same question every day since we stabilized the timeline. "You have?" He led me to the bed and we sat together, his hands still holding mine. "Eleanor, when I went back and rewrote our courtship, when I made myself notice you and engage with you and create opportunities for us to fall in love, I told myself I was doing it to stabilize the timeline, that it was necessary to save Thomas and preserve what we had found together. But the truth is more complicated than that." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and I waited in silence. "The truth is that even in the original timeline, even when I was consumed by grief and could see nothing beyond my own pain, some part of me noticed you. I remembered later, after Thomas died, lying awake in my laboratory and hearing your footsteps in the hall as you checked on me. I remembered the way you brought tea without asking if I needed it, the way you never demanded anything from me but simply existed as a quiet, steady presence. I never acknowledged it then. I was too broken. But the awareness was there, buried beneath the grief. And when I went back to rewrite our past, when I set out to make you fall in love with me, something unexpected happened. He looked at me with such raw vulnerability that my chest ached. I fell in love with you. Not the future you, not the wife I knew I would have, but the young woman I met 3 years in the past. The governess who was brilliant and kind and saw through all my defenses. I did not have to manipulate her feelings because once I allowed myself to truly see her, loving her was inevitable. "But you knew how it would end," I said. "You knew we would marry." Doesn't that knowledge remove the element of choice? It might have, if the past I created had been different from what naturally developed. He squeezed my hands. But Eleanor, I went back with a plan. I had calculated every interaction, every conversation that would be required to guide your feelings in the direction I needed. And I threw that plan away within the first week because it felt like a violation. Instead, I simply allowed myself to be honest with you. I showed you who I was, past the grief and the obsession, and I hoped that would be enough. Every step of our courtship in that timeline was a genuine choice I made. And as far as I can tell from your memories of those 3 years, every step was a genuine choice you made too. I closed my eyes, trying to sort through the memories he was describing, the rewritten past where I had been courted over years. It felt real in my mind, as real as any memory. I could remember Julian asking my opinion on a book, and the surprise and pleasure I had felt at being noticed. I could remember walks in the garden where we discussed philosophy and science and the nature of time itself. I could remember the moment I realized I was in love with him, the terrifying and wonderful recognition that this brilliant, complicated man had somehow chosen to see me. Were those memories false? Or did they represent something genuine that had been created through Julian's intervention? If he had engineered the circumstances, but our responses to those circumstances had been authentic, did that make the love that grew between us any less real? The governess in the original timeline loved you hopelessly, I said, opening my eyes to meet his gaze. That version of me, she loved you without any interference, without any temporal mechanics. That love was completely pure. Julian's expression was sorrowful, and that version of me never gave her the chance to know if her love would be returned. I was too consumed by grief to see what was right in front of me. So yes, her love was pure, but it was also hopeless and one-sided, and doomed to remain forever unexpressed. His voice dropped. Is that really better than what we have now? A love that began with interference, but grew into something mutual and acknowledged and real? I thought about the governess I had been, silent and invisible, carrying feelings that would never be reciprocated. I thought about the woman created by the first timeline shift, married without love, bound by temporal mechanics to a man who was a stranger. And I thought about the woman I was now, with 3 years of memories of being courted and chosen and loved by a man who had fought across timelines to keep me. The memories are strange, I said slowly. They layer and overlap, and sometimes I cannot tell which came first or which is more true. But the feelings, Julian, the feelings are consistent across all of them. In every version of events, I loved you. The circumstances changed, but the essential truth remained. Doesn't that suggest that something about us, about this connection, exists independent of the timeline? He searched my face, hope dawning in his eyes. You think what we have transcends the temporal interventions? I think that you did not create my love for you. You created the circumstances that allowed it to be expressed and returned. But the love itself, that was mine. That has always been mine, in every timeline. I brought his hand to my chest, pressing his palm over my heart. This is real, Julian. What I feel for you is real. Not because the machine made it so, but because some connections are too strong to be denied, no matter how many times the past is rewritten. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me so tightly I could feel his heart racing against mine. I have been so afraid, he whispered. Afraid that I manipulated you into loving me. Afraid that everything we have is built on a foundation of temporal coercion. Afraid that you would wake up one day and realize you never had a choice. We always had a choice, I said into his shoulder. Maybe not about the circumstances we found ourselves in, but about how we responded to them. You chose to save Thomas. I chose to agree to the timeline rewrite. We both chose, in the end, to reach for each other. That's real, Julian. That's as real as anything can be. We held each other in the moonlit bedroom while the house slept around us. Two people who had walked through fire and temporal paradox and come out the other side, still standing, still together. The questions might never fully disappear. We would always carry the knowledge of what had been done, the manipulation and the intervention and the impossible choices. But beneath all of that, there was something genuine, a connection that had persisted across timelines. A love that had survived being erased and rewritten and tested in ways no normal relationship would ever face. Morning came gently, the autumn sun turning the bedroom golden. We rose and dressed and went about our daily routines, but something had shifted between us. An acceptance, perhaps, or a deeper understanding. We had examined the foundations of our relationship and found them strong enough to bear the weight of truth. At breakfast, Thomas announced he was planning a house party for the following month. Friends from university, he explained, and some young ladies from London whom he hoped to impress. Mother, you'll help with the arrangements? And Eleanor, I'm counting on you to ensure I don't make a complete fool of myself. Lady Ashford smiled indulgently. We shall make sure you are the perfect host, Thomas. I watched him across the table, so alive and enthusiastic and blissfully unaware of the impossible sacrifice that had been made for him. He knew intellectually that he had died and been saved, but he did not carry the weight of it the way Julian did. He could not remember the grief, the absence, the hollow space his death had left in the family. For him, there was only this life, this present, this future full of possibilities. Julian caught my eye, and I saw the same thought reflected there. This was why we had done it. This moment of normalcy, of Thomas planning parties and teasing his mother and looking forward to tomorrow. This was worth everything we had endured. After breakfast, Julian and I walked through the gardens together, our hands linked, our steps slow and peaceful. The investigation was behind us. The device was destroyed. The timeline was stable. We had been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance to build a life together, and we were determined not to waste it. There's something I want to show you, Julian said as we reached the far edge of the gardens where the maze began. I've been working on a project. Nothing temporal, he added quickly, seeing my expression. Nothing dangerous. Just something I thought you might appreciate. He led me through the maze, taking turns I did not recognize, until we emerged into a small clearing I had never seen before. In the center was a stone bench, and behind it, a garden. But this was not like the formal gardens surrounding the manor. This was wild and natural, full of flowers that bloomed in profusion without any apparent order. Roses climbed over an old iron trellis. Lavender spilled across the pathways. Moonflowers, which would open at night, twisted around the bench. I had the gardeners plant it last month, Julian said quietly. A private space, just for us. Somewhere we can come when the weight of carrying multiple timelines feels too heavy. Somewhere that exists only in this present, with no connection to any past we've rewritten. I walked slowly through the small garden, running my fingers over the soft petals, breathing in the mingled scents. It was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was a gift of profound understanding, a recognition that we needed places and moments that belonged only to this timeline, this life, this version of us. Do you like it? Julian's voice held uncertainty, as if my approval mattered more than anything. I turned to him and saw the man I loved in all his complexity, the brilliant scientist who had defied the laws of nature, the grieving brother who had refused to accept loss, the husband who was learning to trust that what we had built together was real. I crossed to him and took his face in my hands, meeting his eyes with all the certainty I possessed. I love it. I love you. In this timeline and every other, I love you. He kissed me then, soft and reverent, and I felt the last of my doubts dissolve. We were not perfect. Our foundation was strange and complicated, and built on choices that others might judge as impossible or wrong. But we were here. We were real, and we were choosing each other, every day, with full knowledge of everything we had done and everything we had survived. The months that followed were among the happiest of my life. Thomas's house party was a success, full of laughter and music and the pleasant chaos of young people enjoying themselves. Lady Ashford softened toward me in ways she never had in the original timeline, and I understood that some of her earlier coldness had come from the temporal instability, the sense that something about our marriage was not quite right. Now, with 3 years of stable history behind us, she could accept me fully as her daughter-in-law. Julian continued his research, but he stayed far away from anything involving temporal mechanics. Instead, He focused on practical applications of electromagnetic theory, work that would eventually contribute to the development of better electrical systems. He published papers and attended lectures and built a reputation as a leading scientist of his generation, all without anyone knowing that he had accomplished something far greater and far more dangerous than anything his colleagues could imagine. And I found my own place in this life. I was no longer the invisible governess, no longer the woman who existed in the margins. I was Lady Ashford, with a voice and position and the freedom to pursue my own interests. I began corresponding with other women interested in scientific education. I organized lectures at the manor. I created a life that was mine, not just an echo of someone else's choices. But more than anything, I had Julian. In the quiet moments between social obligations and daily routines, we built a relationship that was ours. We talked long into the night about philosophy and science and the nature of reality. We walked in our secret garden and let the wildflowers witness our joy and our sorrow and everything in between. We made love with the desperate gratitude of two people who knew how easily everything could have been lost. We lived fully in our present while carrying the weight of multiple pasts, and somehow we made it work. It was nearly a year after the investigation when I realized I was pregnant. I had suspected for weeks but had not wanted to say anything until I was certain. When I finally told Julian, he went very pale and had to sit down. A child. His voice was barely audible. Our child. Are you not pleased? I knelt beside him, taking his hands, suddenly uncertain. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. I am terrified and ecstatic in equal measure. A child, Eleanor. A life that exists only in this timeline, only because of the choices we made. He pressed his hand to my stomach, his fingers trembling. What does that mean? What kind of existence will this child have? The same existence we all have, I said gently, real and precious and entirely their own. They will not remember the other timelines. They will not carry the weight we carry. They will simply be our child, born into a stable world, loved by both of us. What if something goes wrong? What if the timeline destabilizes again? It won't. We made sure of that. And even if it did, even if everything we built collapsed tomorrow, this child would be worth it. They are the future, Julian. Our future. And they are proof that what we did was not just about saving the past, but about creating something new. He pulled me into his arms and we stayed that way for a long time, adjusting to the reality of this new life that would join ours. A child who would never know how close they came to not existing. A child who would grow up in a world where their Uncle Thomas was alive and their parents loved each other and everything seemed as it should be. That night, lying in bed with Julian's hand resting on my stomach, I thought about the journey we had taken. From governess and master to wife and husband through the strangest of paths. From separate timelines to a shared present. From manipulation and temporal mechanics to genuine love and freely given commitment. Would I choose it all again, knowing what I know now? The pain and the fear and the weight of carrying memories of lives that never quite were. Would I accept the manipulation of my past self, the forcing of circumstances, the violation of natural causality? Yes. Without hesitation, yes. Because Thomas was alive. Because Julian and I had found each other. Because there was a child growing inside me who would never have existed in any other timeline. Because sometimes the price of love and life and second chances was accepting that the path to them was not clean or simple or morally uncomplicated. We had changed the past and saved a life and created a future. We had done something that should have been impossible, and we had survived it with our humanity intact. And now we would teach our child about choices and consequences and the terrifying responsibility that comes with having the power to change everything. But we would also teach them about love, the kind of love that reaches across timelines and refuses to accept loss, the kind of love that looks at manipulation and temporal paradox and says, even so, what we built is real. The kind of love that chooses to keep choosing every day to stay and build and create something that matters. Spring came again to Ashford Manor. The gardens burst into bloom, and Thomas rode out each morning, and Lady Ashford planned social engagements, and Julian worked in his laboratory on projects that would never threaten the stability of reality. And I walked through the halls of the house that was my home, carrying our child, carrying our memories, carrying the knowledge that we had done the impossible and found grace on the other side. One evening, as Julian and I stood in our secret garden watching the moonflowers open in the twilight, he said, "Do you think we'll ever tell our child the truth about how they came to exist?" I thought about it carefully. When they're old enough to understand, when they can grasp the weight of what was done and the reasons it was necessary, we owe them that honesty. He nodded slowly. And what will we say when they ask if it was right? To change the past? To manipulate causality, to play God with reality itself? We'll tell them the truth, that we don't know if it was right, that we only know it was what we had to do, what we chose to do when faced with loss too great to bear, and that they and Thomas and this life we've built are the results of that choice. Whether it was right or wrong, it was ours. Julian pulled me close, and we stood together in the garden he had made for us, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in this timeline and no other, carrying a child who would be born into a world we had fought to preserve. The past was fixed now, as fixed as it could be. The device was destroyed, the intervention complete, the timeline stable. We could not go back again. We could only go forward, building on the foundation we had created, strange and complicated as it was. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, I would return again and again to this moment. This evening in the garden, with Julian's arms around me and our child safe between us, and the moonflowers opening their pale petals to the night sky. This moment of peace after so much chaos. This moment of certainty after so much doubt. We had changed the past and saved a life, and found each other across impossible odds. We had walked through temporal paradox and Royal Society investigations, and the weight of carrying memories that should not exist. We had questioned everything about the reality of our love and our choices, and our right to exist as we did. And we had emerged with something precious. Not perfect, but real. Not simple, but true. A marriage built on manipulation that had become genuine through the daily choice to stay and love and build. A family held together by secrets and sacrifice. A future that existed only because someone had refused to accept that the past was fixed. It would never be a story we could tell. No one would understand. No one could know. But we would carry it always. The knowledge that reality was more fragile than anyone imagined, that the past could be changed, that love and grief and desperate courage could reshape the world itself. And we would teach our child, and any children who came after, that every moment was precious, that every choice mattered. That the present we lived in was not inevitable, but created through the actions and sacrifices of those who loved us. As the stars emerged overhead and the night settled fully around us, Julian whispered, "Thank you for trusting me, for choosing me, for letting me rewrite our past." I turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting salt and love and the future on his lips. Thank you for seeing me, for fighting for us, for believing that some things are worth any cost. We stood in our secret garden while the moonflowers bloomed and the world turned and our child grew within me. Two people who had bent time itself and somehow, impossibly, found their way home. The journey had been long and strange and fraught with moral complexity. But we had arrived. We were here. We were real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not how we had come to be, but that we were. Together, in this present, building a future one day at a time, carrying our impossible memories and our genuine love into whatever tomorrow would bring. The past was fixed. The present was stable. The future was unwritten and entirely our own. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.